morning, everybody. I am Alberto Villarreal. I am the Managing Director of Nepanoa Transformation Advisory. And today we're going to be speaking about the implementation of USMCA, in particular, the labor chapter, chapter 23. And our guest is the Director General for International Trade Disciplines in the Under-Secretariat of Foreign Trade in the Secretary of Economy. When we talk about those trade disciplines, we're talking about sanitary, trade barriers, intellectual property, environment. And the reason that we are interviewing him and we're having this conversation with him today is because one of those disciplines is actually labor. He led the negotiations of USMCA with regards to labor, and he's also responsible for their implementation. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Ricardo Aranda. Ricardo, how are you today?
Fine, Alberto. Thank you very much for this very kind invitation and very kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here and to speak with the audience about this very important topic of the USMCA and the path forward in the integration process of North America. Fantastic,
Ricardo. Well, without further ado, let's jump into the questions. And to set the stage, could you please give us a summary of the changes between NAFTA and USMCA / T-MEC in Mexico / CUSMA in Canada with regards to labor and the labor environment?
Yes. Well, before going into that particular answer, I would like to refer to the context of the negotiation. And this is something that I usually share with people when I'm asked about the result. I think that in order to understand the result of a process like this, you need to also familiarize yourself with the context in which it evolved and the reasons that gave birth to this important change in the region. So first of all, I would like to set out a series of elements that defined the moment in 2018 when the process started. 2017 actually, sorry. So the first element that I would like to point at is that for many years there was a strong feeling against the NAFTA side agreement on labor cooperation. So many sectors in the US and Canada spoke about the setbacks of that approach and how it fell short of reaching the objective that it was created for, that it was negotiated for. So they asked for a chapter that would be introduced within the agreement, which had the main implication that it may have was to have the same rules for dispute settlement. It's not automatic because there might be chapters in FTAs that don't have the same rules for dispute settlement, even though they are a part of the agreement. But in this case, that was the aim. Having the labor chapter as part of the agreement was entirely the aim. And that was something that Mexico had accepted only before in the TPP process, because we were negotiating the TPP thinking about an upgrade to the NAFTA.
Correct.
And then a series of events happened, and that's my second point. The US administration changed. We were not anymore dealing with the Obama administration, which supported the TPP. We were speaking with the Trump administration, who had a different approach towards trade. And even though it was a Republican administration, the Trump administration had parallel concerns with some Democratic actors in the US. So one of them was the labor part, and this was one of the main elements that gave rise to the critics during the Trump administration, and the messages during the Trump administration about the need to upgrade NAFTA once TPP was not anymore in the scene. So then we had a third component that also had to do with political changes, and was the change in the Canadian administration. We had the Trudeau administration, who had a different approach towards trade also regarding this progressive agenda that they had.
Sure.
And one of the components of the progressive agenda, besides the gender element of the agenda, besides this concern about the well-being of the indigenous people, was the labor side, the social welfare and labor side. Then you have, in the middle of 2017, the result of a it's like a historic case in the labor and trade relationship, which was the U.S. Guatemala case. The U.S. Guatemala case had a result, a report from the special group, from the panel that was created, and it was not favorable to the U.S. So there were, besides the critics that you had regarding the NAFTA side agreement on labor cooperation, you also had critics about the approach that the U.S. had in negotiating the CAFTA-DR agreement in labor cooperation. So this was a whole set of elements that just set the stage for something, for a scenario where we should understand that there was a need to have this discussion with our trading partners in North America. That was the first element.
Okay.
We needed to understand that. We could no longer go ahead with thinking that the way in which the labor and trade relationship has been, let's say, set before could work in the following years. And the last element, the fifth and last element that I want to point out is that in February 24, 2017, constitutional reform was published in the official Gazette.
Sure.
This constitutional reform was a reform that was pushed by the Obama administration during the TPP negotiations. So that was a result of the interest of stakeholders, both in Mexico, the US, and also in Canada, of course, to have an upgrade, a reform, a change in the labor justice system in Mexico. So the constitutional reform was published in February 24. But then you had to implement that reform through an amendment to the federal labor law.
Correct.
Those amendments were not immediate, and there was a need to have those amendments be published 1 year after the publication of the constitutional reform. That didn't happen. So that didn't happen on time, and that reform was finally published on May the 1st, 2019. So
okay.
You have this whole set of elements that constitute a mixture that just presented a very challenging, but not impossible to face or to deal with a scenario in Mexico. And so this gave rise to a chapter that is certainly different from the NAFTA side agreement. And not only that, but to the labor chapter of the TPP. The labor chapter of the TPP didn't have, as the USMCA now has, provisions regarding violence in the workplace, discrimination in the violence against workers, discrimination in the workplace, a stronger provision on forced labor. There were some, and this is very relevant because this goes to the core of the enforcement of the chapter. There were some footnotes that provided clarity to the, let's say, compliance clause of the chapter. To that commitment where you as a country are recognizing that you will enforce your laws. So, and this whole set of elements are a result of the context that preceded the negotiation. For example, those footnotes were the result of the Guatemala case, discussions that took place after the report from the special group was released. And just to conclude, besides those elements that I've already listed, I think that one of the main points that is relevant and that I think that we should speak today is the rapid response, the facility-specific rapid response labor mechanisms.
A rapid response mechanism, yep.
Build upon the enforcement side of the chapter. So
fantastic.
That's what I would like to say about this.
Thank you, Ricardo. Thank you for setting the stage for our audience. That was a good summary. Now, let's take it into the actual implementation, right? I mean, you mentioned violence, you mentioned discrimination, you mentioned forced labor. We can add into that freedom of association, collective bargaining, right? Minimum wage. Mexico, in of itself, was already one of the top 15 economies in the world, right? And continues to be. When we look at these changes, what do you think it's going to be the most challenging one to execute and implement or to comply with in Mexico? What do you think the impacts will be in Mexico?
Well, I think that the most challenging one, I think that Mexico has a very robust federal labor law.
Correct.
So the whole set of labor principles or internationally recognized labor rights that I set out in the chapter are already included in the legislative framework of Mexico. But to answer that question, maybe I should go to the content of the chapter. There's an annex, which is another part that differs from the side agreement and the TPP, which deals with labor representation in Mexico. I think that can give you an answer about more than where is the need. I mean, I would like to phrase it like this. That gives you the answer whenever you ask where was the main concern about from the counterparts from US and Canada in the USMCA negotiation. Collective rights, as we call them, is one of the main concerns. And that annex, as I told you in the initial message, that annex is the result of a discussion for the implementation of the constitutional reform that was published on February 2017. So that's the main element when you speak substantively about the areas where Mexico needs to focus its attention in implementation of the USMCA. I'm not saying that the other labor rights are not important, no, but these deserve special attention during the negotiation. And I must say, to conclude my message here, that the discussion about that on that annex, the discussion on the content of that annex, was not even didn't even took place at the technical table as with all the rounds and all these meetings. It took place at a higher level. So so that could give you a clear picture about the relevance of that part of the chapter, Annex 33A.
23A or 33A?
23. 23 because that's the one that refers to the labor representation in Mexico. The others are
No, the reason I mentioned that is because we already have a question from the audience. And by the way, to the audience, you can ask questions on the little Q&A button that you have at the bottom of your screen. And it's related to that. And it was, could you share your opinion on Annex 23A that was signed during this administration? All right, so.
Yeah, well,
since you mentioned it, you know, I just used it right now.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. It's a very important one. As I said, my opinion is that annex refers to the core elements where Mexico needed to put its attention in order to have an effective implementation of labor rights from the perspective of our trading partners, but also refers the need to take measures in our legislative framework that ensure that the constitutional reform could take an appropriate form. And I think that even though that annex sets a high level kind of commitments for Mexico, we are working towards that. And I think that this might also be part of what we are going to speak today, more detailed, in a more detailed manner.
Sounds good. Thank you, Ricardo. So, I mean, we already mentioned, right? These are the dispositions that USMCA talks about. Mexico needs to work at a legal level, at a governmental level, to make sure that we are aligned with these dispositions. But let's take it down to the business. I mean, what do you think businesses could do or should do at this point in time, apart from reading the labor chapter in USMCA, but apart from reading, what actions should they take right now to make sure that they're complying with the agreement?
Look, whenever we are asked that question in the Ministry of Economy, we normally answer by saying you should be aware of the appropriate implementation of the law in the workplace and by the authorities. So as a business sector, I think that given that we have a very important change in our law published last year, and there's an ongoing implementation of that change right now, you not only need to know that you should implement the law, but you should also be aware of the need to implement the law based on the new changes that were adopted by Mexico. And this is relevant because nowadays this implementation exercise by the Ministry of Labor, coordinated in a whole institutional interagency process in Mexico that also involves the judiciary, it's something that businesses need to know. And I don't intend with this message to say that they should know it by themselves. We are here to let them know that. We are here to let them know that we are available for any kind of question that they may have, hoping that we can answer all of them. But the Ministry of Labor and the Ministry of Economy of Mexico have been working as you may have seen, the Under-Secretariat of Foreign Trade and the Secretary of Economy have been working in an outreach strategy with the different states in Mexico and different sectors. Well, at the micro level, let's say micro, the Ministry of Labor and the Ministry of Economy have been also developing an outreach exercise with businesses for them to know that the level of detail of some commitments in the USMCA might impact them at the facility level. So that's something that they need to know, and the implementation of the law is a responsibility where they are also a part of a team.
Of course. And Ricardo, how can they reach out to the Secretary of Economy, the Secretary of Foreign Trade? You know, how can businesses reach out to you and obtain answers to their questions? Where should they go?
I think that we are the window. We are the window, the Directorate General for International Trade Disciplines, and this might sound like an announcement from DC.
No, I actually asked you the question to make it an announcement. Make it, yes, please. Yes. Inform them.
Thank you very much, Alberto. So they should approach us as a window. We are responsible at the Directorate General for International Trade Disciplines for the implementation, for not only the negotiation. In other countries, the area that negotiates is different from the area that implements the commitments in the FTA. In Mexico, as it might be the case in the US, the same area negotiates and the same area implements. And the area where I'm a party to, is responsible for the implementation of the labor commitments in the USMCA. Not the only one, of course, because we do this in an interagency manner with coordination with the different agencies that have to do with the responsibilities from the chapters in the case that depending on the chapter that we're speaking about. But in this case, it's us. Reach out to us. Think of us like an ally in terms of clarifying your doubts. You're not alone, and that's something that we have been working with in this same way with the Ministry of Labor in Mexico, with STPS.
Fantastic. All right, Ricardo. So now let's get into, I think, the question in everybody's mind, which is, how does the complaints process work? I mean, you just mentioned the rapid response mechanism, which is part of the complaints process. But hey, if you are a Mexican company working with with a US or Canadian company, and there's a complaint. How does that work?
Well, that's a very good question, because when you go back to the NAFTA side agreement, there may be people that the NAFTA side agreement on labor cooperation, so-called NALC in its acronym, North American Agreement on Labor Cooperation, you have two sources of complaints in that agreement. The sources were, in the first instance, the dispute settlement, well, not the first instance, but one of them was the dispute settlement mechanism that was never used under the side agreement. The side agreement actually had a dispute settlement mechanism, but it was never used. It had some particularities that made it different from the dispute settlement mechanism of the NAFTA, but it had its own dispute settlement process. The other one is the public submissions public submission process that allowed for the presentation of complaints from particular sectors from persons from the economy, from each of the three economies, from each of the three members of the agreement. And that one was one of the areas that had frequent use. A person presented a complaint to its national administrative office. The national administrative office in each country was normally the Ministry of Labor. The national administrative office decided whether the complaint had met the requirements for it to be presented to the counterpart. Then it was presented to the counterpart. The counterpart needed to answer it, or to say it in one way or the other. Yes, there's an area of opportunity here to work, or there's nothing to complain about. And that process actually was more active than the other. These two were brought into the TPP, into the CPTPP in the end.
Okay.
And then in the NAFTA, you have also those two again in the NAFTA, in the USMCA, sorry.
Yeah.
You have those two again in the context of the chapter, within the body of the chapter, but you also have a third one, which is one for Canada and one for the US. The annexes 31A and 31B, which are the facility-specific rapid response labor mechanisms. And these both mechanisms, which are basically the same, constitute the same process, were included in the protocol of amendment, on the amending protocol to the USMCA last year, that was signed last year. This was one of the elements that were key for reaching democratic support in the US Congress for the passage of the USMCA. So I don't know if you want me to go a little bit into the details of those, or I'll leave it.
Yeah, I mean, more the process, the steps, right? Let's say that you're a company in Mexico and you receive a complaint, right? Or that you're going to be investigated, right? How does that process work to get to that point? And the reason that I ask you this question around the process, Ricardo, is so that businesses can also prepare. Number one, to avoid such a situation, but number two, in case they're involved with it, just so they can prepare to respond and to react. That's why I'm asking about the process in and of itself.
Yes, that's a very, very important question, and that's, I think, at this moment in time, now that the labor reform it's tied a little bit to the labor reform, to the implementation of labor reform in Mexico. It's tied, but that's one of the key elements, because it has to do with the main implementing activities that we are conducting in Mexico as part of now the entry into force of the agreement. Look, the process is very complex. The process, to start with, the processes in both in Annex 31A and 31B are not simple processes. They look at, now it seems to me that it's the result of discussions within people, both in US and Canada maybe, about the effectiveness of having the general dispute settlement mechanism applying to labor provisions. So right now, since the moment in which the FTAs started to be negotiated, until today, there's only one case under a general dispute settlement chapter, which is the Guatemala US case.
Okay.
So the discussion towards preparing or developing maybe more effective, depending on the point of view of whom you are speaking with, a more effective dispute settlement process applying to labor obligations, maybe took them to conclude that speaking about the facility-specific process might be the key, might be the solution. Still, let's see what happens in the implementation. And there's this process with very tight schedules, with a very tight schedule that applies to particular alleged denial of rights that occur in facilities, in specific factories in Mexico, for example.
Okay.
The process starts with an announcement from one of the parties to the other. Let's say Canada notifies Mexico that it has received a request regarding an alleged denial of rights. So Mexico starts, Canada starts analyzing it, but in that announcement, we expect that there may be some broad information about the case. Both Annexes 31A and 31B offer the possibility for parties to give this early announcement. And I think that may be the case. That's something that we are discussing with our counterparts so that it can take place. An early announcement might help a lot in order to face specific requests or questions when an alleged denial of rights could be presented as a complaint from one party to another. So whenever Canada concludes its analysis, it presents its case to Mexico, and a consultation process starts. A consultation process that involves an internal investigation in Mexico to understand the reason why this alleged denial of rights is being presented or it's being argued. The consultation process might involve a definition from the responding party, in this case Mexico, saying that there's no denial of rights. If that's the case, given an appropriate explanation, the counterpart might say, okay, I understand the point, there's no denial of rights. Or it can say, I'm sure that it's a denial of rights, or I think that it is, regardless of the opinion that you have said, and then it could invoke a panel. That's the first part where a panel can be invoked. So if there's a denial of rights recognized by the party, that's when we're speaking about there's no denial of rights. When the responding party concludes that there is a denial of rights, a discussion might take place in order to agree on a path.
On a solution, forward. On a path forward, correct.
And then you have as I said, the time frame for all of this is counted in days, not even in months or weeks.
Good.
It's days. Weeks could be, but only 2 weeks, for example. and then if the path forward is agreed, that could also open the possibility for its implementation, where the parties should also agree that it's been effective or not. And if it's not been effective, then you have the parties with the possibility of invoking again a panel. And then if there's in the end a result, there's a point where the responding party might also be available there might also be a possibility for the responding party to request establishment of a panel to analyze the final result. But that's the in the end.
Sure.
One of the main issues here, just to conclude, is that the same treatment won't be given if there's a second and third case in the same facility.
Understood.
The penalties or the sanctions might grow in its impact. And what we have been doing, and this is very important now that I have explained the complexity of the process in a very broad way.
I understand. Thank you. And thank you for doing so. Keeping it simple for us.
Yeah, yeah. Because if you read those annexes, it's
I know it's complex. I have read them and I know it's complex, but you know, for our audience,
yeah,
understood.
you need to read them at least twice. So what we have been doing is, given the complexity of this issue and the need to have the stakeholders and in particular the companies, the businesses aware of this, because they could be hit by the mechanism, by any alleged denial of rights case, because there's also a broad scope of application of sectors. Mainly, I think that one question that we have already received, I'm seeing it in the chat, is that which sectors within Mexico and outside of
Correct.
were the most interested in supporting 33A?
Annex 23A.
Well, this refers to the 33A. I would speak about that in a minute.
Sure.
So what we have been doing in Mexico, the government of Mexico, is to approach the business sector, and we are also doing that with the labor sector. But we have started with the business sector. Economía and Trabajo, the Ministry of Economy and Labor in Mexico, have prepared a core group, an interagency group that involved them and also maybe other agencies as needed. But we have approached and gave some explanations about the content of this annex, the way in which it could reach a point where a panel is invoked, and the way in which, if we discussed previously, if we have a very thought of work before reaching a panel, we might be able to resolve that. So the key here is for you to be aware, and I may insist on this, that we are here. Don't wait until there's something that might be constituting a demand or a case against a particular facility. Think about us like allies in how to handle this, because there's a constant communication with our counterparts in the US and
in Canada.
And this might not mean that there would be no cases. No, I mean, but the interest is to work, clarify, coordinate, communicate.
Correct. Correct. I mean, as I'm hearing you, Ricardo, and I'm listening to what you're saying, understanding to what you're saying. From a risk perspective, businesses, you know, number one, right, which they do already, it's understand the law, of course, right? Understand USMCA, the labor chapter, specifically 23A annex. But more importantly, you know, we've heard the ongoing conversation from many people just saying, oh, we're gonna, you know, have to respond to this request constantly. And it's not necessarily the case, right? Number one, there has to be this infraction of rights, right? And number two, it goes through the governments. It also goes through an independent investigation by Mexico, right? In the example that you mentioned, it's Canada, US raises a concern, Mexico investigates, then we respond. And then, you know, getting to the panel, it's almost like the ultimate scenario, right? So that's important for our audience to know and for others to know that this is not like you go from there's a concern to let's go to the panel from one day to the other, right? There's an investigation, there are conversations to fix the issue, if there even is an issue, and then after that, you know, you move on to that ultimate, you know, scenario of the panel. I think that's important for everybody to understand. So thank you very much for providing that process and that guidance. Now, yes, Ricardo,
sorry, Alberto.
Go ahead, please go ahead.
Just to build up on that, some of the questions that we have received, that we received in the last months or weeks, are concerns reflect the concerns of particular businesses, particular facilities, with this notion of having a panel established on day one, or having suspension in trade on day one. I mean, these as I said, these two annexes are complex in nature, and they are the first in its type. So the key is for people to understand that there's a possibility to consult in order to avoid not even the suspension of trade, but the establishment of the panel. So the establishment of the panel doesn't take place on day one, but we need to put our attention and our hands in avoiding, in providing information not more than the one that is allowed by the law, of course, but providing information that could constitute a good explanation or a good path forward towards the solution of the case, in order to clarify whenever there's not even an alleged denial of rights in the facility, to clarify that, or to correct it if that's what's happening.
Quick question here, Ricardo, and trying to prevent all this. Is there going to be a certification that facilities can get? Even before, it's just saying like, hey, we're certified that we're respecting all the labor dispositions in USMCA.
Yeah, well, it's a very important question because you might say, okay, it's a very nice work, the one that you're conducting with the Ministry of Labor, speaking with everybody and reaching out and all that. But let's see the paper. Let's see what's there written, and if there's a formal way in which I could prove that I'm abiding by the law, no? And
Correct.
that I might not be subject to any kind of implementation from an outside actor or something.
USMCA labor certification. Let's call it like that.
That's an idea that has floated in the minds and in the discussions that we have already had. But the collective rights in Mexico and in the world are not normally rights, from my perspective, that could allow, as might be the case for occupational safety and health regulations, for the development of technical regulations or standards that might give you a clear image about compliance, because they deal with more complex matters like having proving that the workers really supported a collective bargaining agreement, and the way in which the elections took place, the conditions under which the elections for the union leadership, or in this case, the support for the collective bargaining agreement, took place in the workplace, in the facilities. So that does not mean that we are close to the possibility of having that discussion. But what we have been doing as part of this outreach exercise with the Ministry of Labor in Mexico is to hear the concerns, and one of the concerns is that to have a checklist on which issues do you need to comply. And given that the parties might have different legislations regarding the collective rights, with particularities that might in every case, we have decided to develop a non-binding document, and this is something that is being worked with the Ministry of Labor, that includes, in a very broad and very clear manner, the way in which the labor reform shall be implemented in the facilities in Mexico.
Of course.
The Annexes 31A and 31B deal mainly with the appropriate implementation of the labor reform and Annex 33A of the USMCA. So, in Mexico. So, those elements are included in a very clear way. That's something that it's still under development. It won't constitute a certification, but it would guide people in the facilities, the main areas, the directive areas.
In what's this?
In what's this, and what they need to do, and also workers, for them to understand that they need to know their collective bargaining agreements before they are working. They might be voting for their support, and they should also comply. They should be benefited by different rights that are provided under the federal labor law in Mexico. So that's a work underway, but it's already well advanced.
That's great.
That's what we have been doing as a complement and in attention to concerns that we've heard.
Of course, and it's a good idea. Ricardo, and when we mention facility, immediately, I think our audience thinks of manufacturing facilities, but I mean, the USMCA also applies to services, right? People provide, in Mexico, providing services to North American companies, correct?
Yes. The brief answer would be, Yes, this also applies
Correct.
to services.
Correct.
The implementation of the annexes also provide for the possibility of applying any kind of sanction or discussing any kind of alleged denial of rights in the services sector.
And Ricardo, when we think about everything that we've been speaking about for the last 40 minutes, right? The labor dispositions, the way that companies need to abide to it, the way that we're going to handle complaints. Let's focus on the people for just a second, right? The worker, the employees. How does this benefit them, right? Because of course this is for the benefit as well, both to increase trade and to unite the North American region more, but also from the worker perspective. How does this benefit the workers in Mexico?
Maybe this goes to the question that we received, to the second question here that we received. The Mexican labor justice regime and let's say labor representation regime have its own characteristics throughout the last century, and those elements have changed substantively with the labor reform, with the federal labor law reform, and also given the constitutional reform that I spoke in the beginning of the session. So the aim would be to have a worker class speaking from their own, not from people that are supposedly representing them, but actually they aren't. I am not saying with this that each and every labor sector in Mexico, each and every industrial sector or productive sector in Mexico had this problem. There were sectors well advanced in labor representation since some time ago. But there were others where the workers were used to some kind of dynamic or way of doing things where the union might have some understandings with the employer. And that's the way also sometimes in which the employers thought that was done. So it was a system where people think that was the way in which things must have been done. But that has changed with the law, with the labor law, with labor law reform in Mexico that is being implemented. The aim is to have workers knowing who are they supporting as leaders of their own union, if they support that union, and mainly the conditions that would apply to their labor environment, to the facilities where they work, which was not something that necessarily happened before. And this is an element where the administration of President López Obrador has put its attention on since the beginning. And from my perspective, that makes total sense. If workers think that their wages are appropriate based on their needs, they shall vote in that sense for their collective bargaining agreements and the reviews afterwards. If voters need an increase or push for an increase, they should be entitled to try to get it. And this is what we are trying to do. This is what the labor reform deals with, and the way in which I see, not only in terms of wages, but also working conditions and improving.
So I guess the way to summarize it is that what we agreed in USMCA, T-MEC, CUSMA, and the Mexican law reform go hand in hand. You can't comply with USMCA, T-MEC, CUSMA if you don't have the Mexican law reform fully implemented and fully executed. They go hand in hand, and they provide a voice to the employees and to the workers of Mexico. Is that appropriately stated?
Yes, that's appropriately stated, and I must recognize the work that the Ministry of Labor is undertaking in this regard. It's really outstanding. I mean, they are even within the context of the pandemic, They have been working at ways in which they could continue moving forward in implementation based on considering the limitations that the pandemic has imposed, of course, but they are moving forward. They are,
Sure.
It's a change that not only because of the USMCA, but it's a change that needs to take place in Mexico, and it needs to be implemented. So that's why we need to go hand by hand with all the sectors, not only the worker sector, not only the labor sector, but also the employers.
Okay. And Ricardo, at Nepanoa, whenever we think of a change, any change that a business is undergoing, we always think about it from the business perspective, we think about it from the people perspective, and we also think about it from the technology perspective. So we've spoken a lot about the people, we've spoken a lot about business. Is there a technology play here? How can technology be used in the implementation of the labor changes in USMCA?
One very concrete and clear example is the digitalization of all the information regarding collective bargaining agreements. So one of the main concerns from the counterparts, and that's something that I heard throughout the negotiations at the technical level, when I was negotiating with my team and the Ministry of Labor, the labor chapter of the USMCA. Rounds, we heard concerns about there's no availability in the website of the agency in charge of having a database of the collective bargaining agreements. So that's super important to have these information and communication technologies up to date. It might sound very simple, but it makes a difference because you put the information at hand, and you might also have the possibility of proving whenever it's possible that the unions, and there's also a website where the unions, right now, the website has been established by the Ministry of Labor from some months ago, I think last year even.
Sure.
To register whenever they have already updated their rules, their internal rules, bylaws. So I think that's one of the main ways in which.
So communication. So being able to communicate and have one source of truth, to call it in a certain way, where we are updating and everybody can take a look at it, right? So,
yes.
Okay, great, good stuff. So I want to encourage, we have one question in the queue, and I want to encourage the rest of our audience to think of questions if they have any for Ricardo. We're going to do a quick true and false set of questions. So Ricardo, I'm going to give you a statement, and I want you to respond with true or false.
Okay.
Start with this. USMCA, T-MEC, CUSMA benefits Mexico the most.
It benefits Mexico the most. True.
There you go. Mexican companies will struggle to comply with the labor requirements in USMCA, T-MEC, CUSMA.
It's if you allow me not to only say one word, I would say.
I'll give you a pass on this one. Say true or false, and I'll give you an explanation. But don't go political enough, Ricardo, please. We all know that you've devoted your career to serving the country of Mexico. Let's keep it. Let's keep it simple.
The problem with this, and I will take a little bit of time to answer this.
That's fine. You can take your time. This is about you. So yes, you can take your time.
This goes also to the question that was posed right now.
Okay, so let me read the question. Let me read the question for everybody else. So it's due to the commitments established in this labor chapter, which are the biggest challenges Ricardo believes Mexican companies will be facing? And the true and false statement was Mexican companies will struggle to comply with the labor requirements of USMCA.
So we shouldn't start by thinking that it is a problem. We should start by thinking it is a challenge, as the question is being posed. I think that the main issue is also not only speak about as a problem, but also speak about as a team. You shouldn't be thinking of companies alone, because asking me if companies will face problems, well, maybe companies might face problems on their own, but they are not alone, as I have said in my interventions. They are part of a team where they count with the support of the relevant agencies in the So the question would be, I think we might be facing challenges to implement it because it's a new agreement. And I might recall in the 90s when the negotiation of the NAFTA took place and it's entering into force, that also posed challenges and we were capable of dealing with them. We should prove that we're capable of dealing with them in this context. So I went political, I'm sorry, but I hope
no,
that
you didn't, it's fine. That was good. That was a good answer. So yes, I mean, we will struggle, but it's not a struggle. It's a challenge, and we just need to work through it. It's not
together.
And together, correct. It's not companies alone. Okay, third statement. The Canada, US, and Mexico relationship is very strong.
Speaking from Mexico's perspective, yes, it's strong.
What do you mean by that?
True.
From the US perspective, wait. From the US perspective, is it strong? From the Canada perspective, is it strong?
I am, since I am a Mexican official, I'm not entitled to speak about from the perspective of the other governments, but from my perspective, it's strong, and having the USMCA being put in place appropriately and having constant communication with our counterparts at the different levels of the hierarchy reflects that the relationship is strong from my perspective. Okay. So that's my point.
Okay, and I'll give you my perspective, and it is that the fact that USMCA, T-MEC, CUSMA still went through, even though we were in the middle of a pandemic, I think it does show the collaboration, at least from the government officials' perspective, to establish a new set of rules as we reemerge, as the economy re-engages in North America, right? The supply chains across the three countries, Canada, United States, and Mexico, are 100% depending on each other. You know, it's not, businesses in the United States cannot survive with businesses in Mexico. Businesses in Mexico cannot survive without businesses in Canada, right? The three of us, we are connected. And I think that the way that from a trade standpoint, the way that the past 5 months have been handled, I think it has been fine, right? You know, there's been a lot of collaboration to open specific sectors of the economy to be able to support the supply chain of the North American region. So from that perspective, I do believe that the relationship is strong.
Yes. Actually, I can't agree more with you. That you read my mind. It's strong. It's certainly strong, and that's the proof. Having the USMCA entering into force, it's a proof.
Fantastic. Companies will leave Asia. Of course, there's a focus there in China, and come to Mexico instead.
True.
Excellent. And then the last one. Mexico can provide a secure environment for foreign investment.
True.
Perfect.
And the entry into force of the USMCA it's a signal in that direction.
Fantastic. Ricardo, do you have any closing thoughts or remarks?
Yeah, I mean, just to conclude, and I appreciate the invitation, I appreciate the questions. There are challenges in the implementation of the USMCA in Mexico. There are certainly challenges here that we might be facing. The new set of disciplines is something that even having a difference from what you already knew, either in the CPTPP or in the NAFTA Labor Cooperation Side Agreement, provides already some degree of concern for some people, no? We should understand that the reaffirmation of our will to integrate with North America and to have to ensure the integration in the region is also part of a process where we need to assume responsibility. And new areas of negotiation like labor, like environment, that had a strong interest from people in the other side of the border, should also concern us, and this just sets the stage, from my perspective, to have good rules, upgraded rules in some cases maybe, and a higher level of understanding between our countries, so as to improve the position in Mexico as a reliable trading partner and as a serious trading partner in the stage. That might be broad, that might take some ideas that you might have already heard, but from speaking from my perspective and my own responsibilities, the changes that the USMCA is promoting and has already formalized in some cases reflect the impact, the huge impact that this responsibility of integrating with North America has for Mexico. So I hope that this conversation has been useful. I appreciate a lot your invitation, Alberto, and hope that this is not the last one in which we have the chance to speak.
Ricardo, my takeaways from our conversation are that Mexico was already on the path, given our labor law, the changes in our labor law, to actually comply with the dispositions and the regulations in USMCA. I do believe that they go hand in hand. The second takeaway is that businesses must understand that they are not alone in this. You have support, both from the Secretary of Economy, the Secretary of Foreign Trade, and also from businesses like ours, like Nepanoa, right? That we are having these discussions on a daily basis, and we know where to find the right information and how to prevent any issues in the future. And the third one is that in this negative scenario that we're living today, just from the news that we're hearing, from the COVID perspective, I do believe that and this is personal, this is not Ricardo's words, this is totally personal. I do believe that USMCA, T-MEC, CUSMA does provide an avenue for the economy to re-engage, and it's a boost to the economy in North America, in all three countries. Ricardo, thank you very much for your time. Greatly appreciate you taking 60 minutes of your time this morning. I know that you are tremendously busy. Yesterday, for our audience, Ricardo was almost the most famous person in Mexico because he held a great press conference on intellectual property and other areas. Because, by the way, he also was the leader of the negotiation regarding intellectual property of USMCA, and he's also in charge of the implementation of intellectual property. So, Ricardo, we may bug you again in the future to talk about intellectual property, if you don't mind.
It would be very welcomed. I appreciate the time that also the audience took to hear us, to hear this conversation, and look forward to any new engagement with Nepanoa, with you, Alberto. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. We just had a conversation with Ricardo Aranda, Director General for International Trade Disciplines in the Under-Secretariat of Foreign Trade for Mexico. I am Alberto Villarreal, Managing Director of Nepanoa Transformation Advisory. Thank you all for your time.